It's the summer of 1920. Tom Birkin is in Oxgodby, a remote North Country village, to restore a medieval wall painting. He's been working hard, but is finding contentment in the work, his surrounding countryside, and the relationships he's building up with Charles Moon, the Ellebecks, and Alice Keach, the vicar's wife. However, when he visits the vicarage, he's disturbed by how anxious Alice is, far removed from the relaxed Alice who sits in the church talking to him while he works at the painting.
There was so much time that marvelous summer. Day after day, mist rose from the meadow as the sky lightened, and hedges, barns, and woods took shape until at last the long curving back of the hills lifted away from the plain. Each morning when I leaned on the churchyard gate dragging at my first fag, I had a feeling of immense content. Back in the bell tower, I brewed up, fried a couple of rashers and a round of bread, and emptied my slops from the window into a nettle patch. Then I climbed down to go behind the lilac bushes, and afterwards, using Elijah Fletcher's tomb as my washstand, shaved. By this time, Moon was stirring and waiting for me to go across and have a mug of tea. Once I got on the job of cleaning the wall painting, I worked hard enough, but for a short midday break until 6 or 7 in the evening. By this time, the apex of the arch and its left-hand side were almost uncovered. The notabilities in the painting had been given notable treatment. The artist had even used gold leaf on the clothes. In fact, here and there, the willingness of whoever had put up the money had gone to his head, and he'd been staggeringly prodigal with the expensive reds and the almost prohibitively priced leaf. But once he'd begun, as I was now beginning, on the damned souls dithering on the brink of the flames or hurtling headlong into them, he'd switched to the cheap stuff, red earth and iron oxides. But he'd compensated by his vigorous treatment. He'd really warmed to the work, thrown in the lot, hand and heart. So each day, I released a few more inches of a seething cascade of bones, joints, and worm-riddled vitals frothing over the fiery weir. A few wretches were still intact. One I could have sworn was a portrait. A crescent-shaped scar on his brow made this almost certain. His bright hair streamed like a torch as he plunged headlong down the wall. 2 demons with delicately furred legs clutched him, one snapping his right wrist whilst his mate split him with shears. It was the most extraordinary piece of medieval painting that I had ever seen, anticipating the Bruegels by 100 years. What, in this single detail, had pushed him this immense stride beyond his time? So there I was, knowing that I had a masterpiece on my hands. Each day I used to avoid taking in the whole by giving exaggerated attention to the particular. Then in the early evening light, when the westering sun shone in to briefly light the wall, I would step back and look. It was breathtaking. A tremendous waterfall of color, the blues of the apex falling, then seething into a turbulence of red. One evening I was so lost in it that I didn't hear Moon climb the ladder. When he spoke, it was plain that he, too, had been overwhelmed. "Look," he said. "Look at the faces. You could swear they're real people. Well, were real people. Those 2 herdsman angels, the ones with the whips, I swear they're dancing. Amazing. Do you know, in some ways, it brings back the whole bloody business in France, particularly the winters. Those red evenings when the barrage was starting up and each man wondered if this was to be the night. And here shall come with wonders red, to damn the quick and the dead." I didn't see it like that. No doubt I didn't want to. Oxgodby was another world. It had to be. To me, this was just a medieval wall painting, something peculiar to its time and nothing more. So I just told him that if this one was different, it was because it had been painted by one man, as compared with Chagro, where it is believed the drawing was done by the master painter, but the colouring had been filled in by assistants. I don't think he was listening. "I feel terribly smug," he said. "Just the 2 of us knowing about it before the art critics catch on and suck out the magic. Now it's just ours." "There's Alice Keach," I said. "I think she knows too." He glanced curiously at me and said, "I rather hope there might be something coming on between you 2. No? Pity. She's wasted on Keach." "I let her up onto the platform a week ago," I said. "After all, she comes and sits by the door every couple of days and shows an intelligent interest." "In this?" Or you? You've never told me. Are you married? I told him about Vinnie and that she'd gone off with another chap. I didn't tell him that she'd almost certainly bedded down with other men while I was overseas, nor that she'd left me once before. Fair enough, Moon said. Feel we've known each other well enough for you not to mind my asking. I've never met the right one myself. We didn't speak for some time. There's a couple of details here might interest you, I said, and pointed to the falling man. He was covered over years before the rest. Moon shuffled forward and examined him with lively interest. Yes, he said. I see what you mean. This crescent scar, one could swear he was meant to be identifiable. But your painter never would have dared. Too bad. It's a riddle without an answer for you, Birkin. Mossop thinks Keach will have the whole painting whitewashed over as soon as I leave, the minute I'm on the train. Our sexton has a low opinion of his fellow men. Then we climbed down, and when I'd had a swill at the graveyard pump, we went across to his tent and brewed up. It was about 7 o'clock, and so still I felt that if someone had spoken a mile away, I could have answered him. We sat in the warm sunshine. He smoked, and I thought about Alice Keach. I'd never considered her except as a charming woman I'd enjoyed talking to and given an excuse looking at. But Moon's speculative inquiry had changed that, and now I found it pleasantly disturbing to consider the possibility of wandering off with her to some quiet room, eating supper, taking her hand, kissing, then turning towards each other in the dusk. Well, we have our dreams. Oh, God, here he comes, Moon muttered. He carries a depressive blight around. Good evening, Keach said, looking uneasy when neither of us answered. I was just passing. Have you found anything yet, Moon? No, Moon answered. Well, I don't suppose for a minute there is anything to find. Poor Miss Hebron was not quite herself towards the end. She became obsessed with the idea of finding the grave of her ancestor. Moon didn't reply. Keach looked helplessly about him. He said half-heartedly. Complete and utter waste of money. Moon gazed into the distance. It's disgraceful, he said savagely, then went off. However does the charming Alice put up with him? Moon said. Poor Miss Hebron, she wasn't herself at the end. I bet there was enough of herself to settle him into his place because he still resents it. Mossop told me she had him weighed up and right from the start gave him no change. Come on and I'll show you our benefactor's lair. We walked along the stream and then across a footbridge, down a lane, turned past a gate covered with a rind of green mould and off its hinges into an unkempt drive. The house itself, early Victorian, was immense, its walls full of windows and downpipes. It stood amid rose beds that had become briar patches, rough grazing once lawns, bushes become trees, and trees thickets. Miss Hebron is described as greatly resembling her house, Moon murmured. She either threw her clothes on or slept in them. Mossop tells me she bought several outsized thick skirts at a jumble sale, and one after the other wore them out over several years. You'll have to do better than that, I remarked. You make her sound no more than a bundle of clothes. Very pale eyes, grey, I imagine. Her hair kept changing colour, I'm told. Once it was orange. Very long, thin nose. Her teeth, that's what people mention most. They were extra large when she smiled. Mossop says he found her frown less alarming. I looked at the decaying house. There must have been 30 rooms, maybe more. And long corridors, staircases, box rooms, cellars. Poor woman. At night she would have to go about with a candle, fumbling in the creaking blackness when drafts blew it out. She had a sister living with her once, I'm told, Miss Hetty. She normally would have been in an asylum, but Miss Hebron wouldn't let anyone examine her. And now the Colonel's left on his own. Moon nodded. What are your feelings about growing old, Birkin? It wasn't an inconsequential question. I could tell that he really wanted an answer, a second opinion. I can't imagine, I said. I can't imagine it happening to me. It's too far away now. Well, do you wonder? You know what it was like in the war. There can't have been many of us who thought we'd need to worry about growing old. Or what comes after that, he said. Also has done well shall go to bliss. Also has done either to pain wis. Oh, come on, I said irritably. We went into the war and we came out. That's good enough for me. We're here on borrowed time and I'll take what's to come as it comes. And I did. The steady rhythm of living and working got into me, so that I felt part of it and had my place, a foot in both present and past. I was utterly content. But I didn't know this until one day Alice Keach said, You're happy, Mr. Birkin. You're not on edge anymore. Is it because the work is going well? Of course she was right. But that wasn't all of it. There was this weather, this landscape, these people. I had my dinner with the Ellebecks each Sunday now. I recall one particular meal early in August. We were drinking our tea when Mr. Ellebeck, with no more than a hint of martyrdom in his tone, remarked, "Well, it's Barton Ferry for me this afternoon, Mother. I'm preaching there." "You'll be tired out," Mrs. Ellebeck said fiercely. "At your age, you should be having a lie down, not pedalling down that long road." "And the wind always against you, whether you're coming or going," Kathy put in. "Perhaps Tommy will go for you," Mrs. Ellebeck said resourcefully. "I've never done anything in that line," I protested. "The Lord will put words into your mouth," Mr. Ellebeck said. Barton Ferry lay 4 long miles distant along a featureless road. There were a few cottages, and on a patch of grass, a brick chapel scarcely bigger than a large room. A brown-faced, pretty young woman was waiting by the door. I explained lamely that Mr. Ellebeck was off colour. She made no comment, but neither did she seem overly cast down as she let me in and asked for hymn numbers. On 0 hour, 2 freckled children, a red-faced farm lad, and an elderly man trooped in and penned themselves like sheep below me. After we'd bellowed "Crown him with many crowns," I basely determined that I must abandon my awful impersonation. "Look here," I declared quite fiercely. "I'm just filling in, and as I've not preached before and certainly shan't again, I'm going to tell you what I'm doing in Oxgodby, and if you want to leave or nod off, that's all right by me." Actually, they recognized the good sense of this and listened with great attention as I described my work in uncovering the great medieval wall painting in Oxgodby Church. The children put up their hands and asked several sensible questions. Afterwards, I thanked my organist, and as she was locking the door, made to put on my bicycle clips. "You could come on home for your tea," she said. I wanted to. Perhaps I could ask her to meet me again. I was missing a woman badly. She lived in a farmhouse gable end to the road. Her father and mother made me very welcome. In conversation, it came out that I'd been over there, and then I noticed a framed photograph of a young soldier on the piano top. "That's our son, our Perce," Mr. Sykes said. "He had it taken on his last leave, on his 19th birthday. A glance across those faces made it unnecessary to ask what had befallen Perce. And on my way home by the dyke side, on the empty road between fields of corn blowing like water, I suddenly yelled, "Oh, you bastards! You awful, bloody bastards! You didn't need to have started it, and you could have stopped it before you did. God? There is no God." Within 24 hours of my performance at Barton Ferry, word had got around about tea at the Sykeses. "Here you're herring round the countryside looking over girls," Moon said slyly. "Thinking of settling down in Oxgodby, then? Better keep it quiet that you're wed. Every second chap roundabout has got a shotgun." Even Alice Keach had heard. But she put it more obliquely at the end of a conversation that had begun by her asking if I'd wanted to be an artist. "No," I said. "Never thought of it. Didn't know what I wanted to be." "What about the church? I hear you were a great success at the ferry. And that you've fallen in love." She'd gone before I had time to reply. Her gay laughter slipped back through the open door. Well, she was right. I'd fallen in love. But not with sweet Lucy Sykes.
6th of an 8-part book at bedtime, A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr. Tom Birkin is in Oxgodby, remote North Country village, to uncover and restore a medieval wall painting in the church. It's proving to be a marvellous summer of 1920, and Tom, happy in his work, has a feeling of immense content. Believing he has a masterpiece on his hands, he wonders why a most extraordinary piece of medieval painting should be covered in the first place. Charles Moon, still in search of the lost grave, shares his wonder, as does the beautiful Alice Keach, who Tom now realizes he is in love with.
You might wonder what I thought about during the many hours I spent up on the scaffold in Oxgodby Church. Well, obviously the work itself, the vast wall painting I was uncovering. But also the nameless man who'd stood where I stood. Not his technical abilities, although, quite properly, these were extremely interesting to me. For instance, He had a very, very good line in hands, his speciality being knuckles and wrists, but he wasn't much good at feet.
It was his quirks which really fascinated me. As when, for instance, he dropped iconographic rules to slyly lift the line of a man's lips, or turned aside to rattle off a string of grace notes on a costume's edge, things just done for the hell of it. And there was always the enigma of this final falling man with a crescent-shaped scar on his forehead. Simon Magus, the chap who tried to buy the Holy Ghost? His torments were well documented. The establishment had seen to that. But if he was that famed apostate, why had he been painted with so much verve? And why had he been blotted out so much earlier than the rest? And why plunging into hell, was he himself? Had the painter known him? Was it a portrait recognizable to kinsmen who had hidden him from public view almost before the paint was dry? Well, it was several hundred years too late to ask now. "How are you two getting on together?" Moon would say, waving a hand at my wall. "Do you ever feel him breathing down your neck, nudging you? Good lad, Birkin, attaboy. You must know this painter chap pretty well. Go on, tell me about him. Who was he?" Who was he? I couldn't even name him. People don't seem to understand those far-off folk. They simply weren't us. Our idea of personal fame was alien to them. This man of mine, for instance, knew nothing of earlier artists, so why should he suppose anyone would want to know anything of him? So it wouldn't even occur to him to sign his work. Of the 100 wall paintings, I knew of only a single signature, Thomas of Malmesbury at Ampney Crucis. And the idea that his work might be minutely observed 500 years after his death would have been preposterous. In his day, buildings were being drastically remodeled every 50 years as fashions changed, so that my man would calculate his painting at the longest would last no more than a couple of generations. What did he look like? Ah, no, that was different. I couldn't put a face on him, but he was fair-headed. Hairs kept turning up where his beard had prodded into tacky paint, particularly the outlining in red ochre, which he'd based in linseed oil. There was no mistaking it for brush hair, which was recognizable from its length, an inch, never more than an inch and a half. Sow's bristle for the rough jobs, badger's grey for precision. Quite impressive. And what else can be established about our departed brother? Right-handed, about your build. He had to use some sort of stool to get up to 6 feet. That's if I'm right about the parts he did on his knees or crouched on his haunches. That's about all. Well, maybe he'd lived in some monastery. Only a guess, but his hands talked like monks' hands must have talked in the long silences. Oh, one last thing. He didn't trust his apprentice. He did the lot, except this bottom bit, this corner of hell. Look, you can see it's a rough job. Fill in. Can't understand why he handed over to his lad when his nose was at the winning post. "It's more than I can tell from my damned stones," Moon said, and went. Ah, yes, this was his great work. Whatever he'd been employed on before could only have been a workout for this. He'd sweated here, tossed in his bed, groaned, howled over it. The Christ's torn hands, those agonized fingers. "And hair shall come with wonders red." And then I knew why that last yard of fire wasn't his. This was his last job. He'd had enough, could stick it no longer. He'd left, thrown in his hand. But in those days, you couldn't leave. They'd have hauled him back and kicked him into a conclusion. So he must have died on the job. But his last brushstrokes had been steady and sure. He'd been as fit at the end as when he'd begun. And then I understood. I turned and, shuffling to the scaffold's edge, stared down at the stone-slabbed floor. He'd fallen. Great God. I scrambled down the ladder and ran from the church. Moon had almost reached his tent. "He fell!" I yelled after him. "This was his last job! He fell!" Moon turned, and as it sunk in, he grinned. "Okay," he called back. "Mind your own step, then." Alice Keach came next day about tea time, but I only knew when I heard someone on the ladder. "Too late again to stop me," she said. "I'm here." Then she didn't speak for some time. I'd have been astonished if she had. At close quarters, face to face, my wall was daunting, and she was daunted. I heard her draw in breath. Then she said, Do you believe in hell, Mr. Birkin? Now that was a thought. Hell. Passchendaele had been hell. Bodies split, heads blown off. Groveling fear, shrieking fear, unspeakable fear. The world made mud. But I knew it was Bible hell she had in mind, hell that went on, an aching, timeless hell. So I answered, well, it depends. Hell's different things to different people and different things to the same person at different times. She didn't question this. I swear she'd read my mind. She knew. Then what about hell on earth? She said. I told her I'd seen it and lived there, and that mercifully they usually left an exit open. Then neither of us spoke for a longish time. And I thought that there might be something to be said for seasons in hell, because when we dragged ourselves back from the bloodiness, life had seemed brighter than we'd remembered it. We'd sloughed off the pals who'd gone down into death. While it was day, that is. At night, in the dark, for a time they came back, but we wanted no part of what they now were. Theirs was another world. Hell, if you care to call it that. And then there was my wife, Vinnie. That had been a sort of hell. But I'd crawled from its pit, and here in Oxgodby life had flooded back, tingling to my fingertips. A world of new people who only knew as much of what had happened to me as I cared to tell them. Well, she said. Yes, I answered. I've been there. I have a map of it in my head, and Mr. Moon will bear me out. They kept sending us back there, and that hell was worse than this chap's. But even as I spoke, I knew she wasn't answered. It was neither that, nor a Bible hell that made her ask. Oh, she said, I'm sorry. It was a silly question. That was the missed moment. I should have put out a hand and taken her arm and said, here I am. Ask me, now. The real question. Tell me. While I'm here, ask me before it's too late. And maybe she knew this because she murmured that she must go and turning away climbed down. She's lovely, I thought. She's shy, alarmed easily like a wild animal. How did Keach get her? Trap her? Overwhelm her? What was it like that first night together? Had he knelt by the bed first? Those dark eyes staring into the darkness of some hotel room. She could scarcely have known what marriage meant before then. Yet, who knows, doubtless she saw more, much more in Keach than the rest of us. Nothing's so secret as what's between man and wife. I followed her down. I've left you a few fresh eggs, she said. Then, when she'd gone off to the village, I went across to Moon's tent and we sat on the grass in the evening sunshine. I've been talking over hell with Mrs. Keach. He laughed. Do you think about it often? I said. He pursed his lips, wrinkled his nose, and studied the back of his hand. Then, and this was unusual, he looked directly at me. Often, he said. Particularly at night. That's the bad time. Your window's open, you must have heard me. He knew there'd be neither perfunctory sympathy nor questions. And I tell myself it will be better as time passes and it sinks further back. But now we're different. We know. We're men apart. Maybe wives know. Yes, of course they must. And people do understand. I met a chap who went back to teaching. Like you, he'd been a signaller, out in the middle, out on his own with only a wire trailing back to his battery. He told me that for the first 4 weeks, if a pupil dropped a desk lid, he'd throw himself onto the floor. At first they used to snigger. Then they didn't laugh anymore, only stared horrified or in pity. Finally, they just pretended not to notice. Me? In the middle of it, I used to think, well, we're in the shadows now, but they'll have to blow the whistle someday, and then, all at once, it'll be different. We'll go from this to that. But of course it couldn't be like that, could it? It has to work itself out. So I keep reminding myself that I'm still a bit round the bend, and perhaps always shall be. He laughed. You too? It was a question that he didn't expect to be answered. The side of my face had been clicking away as he talked. It's not anything like so bad as when you first turned up, he said. I flushed, but he went on. I don't suppose you noticed it happening, but Oxgodby's just about ironed you out. We sat for some time without speaking. At dusk, a few lads came into the meadow and began larking about. A plate layer crossed, pushing his bike along the path to the station. Sometimes, I half wanted it to happen, Moon said. There were times when I'd had enough. Well, you know what I mean. When I was sure my nerve would give way and I'd lie down before I was hit. Or worse, I wouldn't be able to drive myself over the top. So many had gone, chaps I cared for. Sometimes it seemed that they were the lucky ones. But I remember them less well now. They're dwindling. And I thought of the great picture at the top of my ladder. But theirs was a different hell from ours. The moon had risen. A slight breeze stirred the shadows of trees across fields of barley, white like water. Look here, Moon said, we need a break. Damn it all, we're not wage slaves. They're not pouring money over us. Let's take each day as a dividend for what's past. I'll fix it with Mossop. Tomorrow we'll have a holiday. So next day we downed tools and went off into the big field where Mossop was working. Already it was a day of great heat. The barley heads were brittle and bowed, and you could have sworn there was an oven smell in the air. When the dew had dried, the reaper binder, its sails flickering, the horses fresh and skittish, began tossing out sheaves, and we started to stook. And we went on back and forth across the cracked earth in the growing heat till midday, when each sheaf's shadow was no more than a black tip. Then it was dinner time. Missus expecting you two gents. And rabbit and potato pie put fresh heart into us and carried us on until, at 4, the Lowents came. Green gauge pie and scalding hot tea in a can. And we finished in the dusk, a first star rising about the dark rim of the hills. Cathy Ellerbeck was waiting in the deep roadside grass by the field gate. Don't forget you're coming to Ripon with us tomorrow, she said. My dad's expecting you to help him choose a new organ for the chapel. Mr. Douthwaite's coming too. It was useless to claim that I'd been having a holiday all day. She was remorseless. What about Mr. Moon here, I asked. But no, he couldn't come. The trip was a reward for service. My help with the big lads at Sunday school, and Mr. Moon hadn't rendered any. And, she said, he's church. How do you know that? I asked. As far as I know, he doesn't go anywhere. From his twang, she said. Posh. Oh, Moon said. So by his vowel sounds shall ye know them? Well, what about charity? Aren't all Christians? She had the sense not to admit religion into the argument, young as she was, knowing it pointed the way to all manner of disagreeable conclusions, so he didn't finish his sentence. It's a rule, she said. And anyway, Mr. Birkin's nearly finished his job, whereas you've not found Miss Hebron's ancestor's grave, and that's what you're being paid to look for. Don't be late, Mr. Birkin. The train goes at 8.
That was the 6th part of A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr. It was abridged by Elizabeth Bradbury, read by Samuel West, and produced by Tracy Neal. And you can hear the penultimate episode at the same time tomorrow evening.
This is Radio 4, now the 7th of an 8-part book at bedtime, A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr. Tom Birkin, a shell-shocked survivor of the Great War, is in Oxgodby, a remote North Country village, to restore a medieval wall painting in the church. Charles Moon, another war survivor who's searching for a lost grave, has questioned Tom as to how he's getting on and who he thinks the painter might be. A train of thought has now been set in motion, and the mystery begins to unravel when Tom suddenly realizes that it was the painter's last job, and that it wasn't completed because he fell from the scaffold. Tom's relationship with both Charles and Alice deepens as they exchange confidences, and he feels he's really accepted by the villagers when the Ellerbeck family invite him to accompany them on a trip to Ripon to buy a new organ for the chapel.
While I was working on the painting, I only left Oxgodby once, to visit Ripon. Of course, I had meant to see its minster while I was in those parts, but I doubt if I'd made the trip if Mr. Ellerbeck hadn't made me stir myself. It happened because the trustees had painfully agreed that they could just about afford to replace the chapel harmonium with an American organ. Actually, it was hearing tell that church lot are going to have a new pipe organ, Cathy told me confidentially. It's all right for them. They don't have to forever be raising money to pay the minister like us, she said bitterly. Their money comes from away. We'd be more than obliged if you join us, Mr. Birkin. Mr. Ellerbeck said. "You have a real eye for quality, there's no doubting it. That anybody can tell. And we want the best. Well, put it this way, we want the best we can afford. There'll only be the four of us, Mr. Douthwaite, you, Cathy, and me." We went by train and found Mr. Baines's piano and organ warehouse in a back street off the marketplace. "It's deputation from Oxgodby Wesleyans come about to organ," Mr. Douthwaite said, bending forward nervously. "Mr. Baines knows all about us. Mr. Ellerbeck here wrote a letter to say we were coming on the 2:15. "Mr. Baines isn't with us any longer," a well-turned-out young man said. "I am the new proprietor." He priced our raiment and added, "I suppose it is a pedal organ? Something second-hand?" We nodded in shame. "You'd better have a look behind that lot over there. We took them in part exchange from go-ahead churches. I don't know what you'll find, not much, I expect. And please note we do not give any guarantee." "I suppose it's in order to try one or two out?" Mr. Douthwaite asked deferentially. He was not answered. The proprietor was already gliding away to greet more promising customers. Now, once this grand person had gone, Mr. Ellerbeck became himself again. His eye brightened and a note of derision returned to his voice. "Cathy, lass, fetch yon music stool and let's hear you sound this one out." And having arranged her long hair and jamming her hat on more firmly, that's what she did, vigorously putting the organ and all people that on earth do dwell through their paces. She tried another, then a third. It was decided that this was the favourite and thus must be tested to its very limit. However, at this moment, the other customers must have decided on a similar course, and began releasing peals of thunder and strident fanfares from what announced itself to be a large, very expensive pipe organ. "Go and inquire how long he's going to make that din for, Mr. Birkin," Cathy ordered. So I sidled out from the cast-offs and, skirting several thickets of music-making impedimenta, emerged into a clearing reserved for grander clients. And these were the Keaches. I stopped in my tracks, but before I could melt back guiltily into the friendly jungle, Alice Keach turned. At that moment, the better to conduct pneumatic investigation, Mr. Douthwaite mounted a chair, thus explaining my presence. Her eye brightened. For a moment I believed that she would burst out laughing. Perhaps she did. But at that moment the proprietor released another blast on his organ, and under cover of its barrage, I retreated. "They've just about finished," I lied. "Well," the station master said, "I think this is it, Mr. Douthwaite. Still, before we finally plump for it, let's see how it sounds with a bit of singing. Here, number 119, Cathy, worthy is the lamb." And off they went, Cathy leading in an unusually strong soprano howl. I examined the ceiling, wondering what Alice Keach was making of the din. They were well into verse 3 before a maniacal yell choked them off. It was the proprietor, beside himself with rage. "Here!" he shouted. "Stop that row! You can't have a blasted choir practice here. My other customers can't hear themselves." The three songsters tailed off into shamefaced silence. "We'll have this one," Mr. Ellerbeck said. "I'll have it collected by NER." And Mr. Douthwaite recovered his aplomb with splendid élan. "Any discount for cash?" he asked, taking out a pile of soiled notes and a bag of silver. "Let's say a couple of pounds off, cash down." Business was business to the Oxgodby deputation, and leaving the flabbergasted vendor, off they went to catch the 4-7, dragging their reluctant organ player with them. But I excused myself, feeling that I couldn't decently leave the place without admiring its minster. So I went down the hill to the great rambling barn of a building. But for an ancient verger pottering about, I had the great forest of stone all to myself, and for an hour pottered and marvelled with him. Then I shambled back to the marketplace and had buttered tea cakes in a room behind a baker's shop, and it was a very good pot of tea, hot and freshly made. I lost myself going over the afternoon, marvelling that I'd been asked to help pick an organ, uncomfortably wondering what Alice Keach had thought, hoping that perhaps, against all odds, she might slip in here for tea or travel home on the 6:20. I lit a woodbine. Someone, a customer, another man, came in, but I didn't turn until he spoke. "Well, would you credit it? Do you live here?" At first I didn't recognize him. "Milburn," he said. "Sergeant Milburn." I knew him then. He hadn't been a bad chap. I believe he was a Kitchener volunteer, not a conscript like me. I'd last seen him in a roofless billet at Bapaume. "Last time I saw you, they were carting you off," he said. "Let's see. Shell shock, wasn't it? Advanced signaller, weren't you? Not many of you chaps came through." He moved over to my table, and told me that he was a commercial traveller in ironmongery. I told him that I was working on the wall painting in the church at Oxgodby. He sounded amazed that I'd been at the London College of Art before I was called up. Never would have guessed, he said. Just took it you were some sort of clerk. Then I mentioned Moon. Moon, he said. A stocky chap. Reddish-faced, spoke la-di-da. He saw from my face that he had the right man and laughed. I bet they knocked hell out of him in the glass house, he said. His sort always got it worst. A corporal who had it in for him gave the game away. The MPs found him in bed with his backman. Poor bugger. I suppose he was born that way. It was like a blow in the face, but I didn't think he noticed. They really shat on him at the court-martial. Crucified him. Corruption of young men, dishonour of the King's Commission, that sort of balls. His MC made it worse. Can't understand that. He's never mentioned an MC, I said. Immediate award. Brought in one of his chaps from the wire. Went back when he heard another one screaming, even though he must have known it was all up with him. Then he said, perhaps I shouldn't have told you. Well, keep it to yourself. Better not mention we met. He pushed out a hand, shook mine, and went. Knowing Moon was homosexual didn't upset me, though of course it wasn't something I could forget. It was the idea of an independent man, a proud spirit being shut up like an animal in a military prison, and having to put up with the ghastly crew who always seemed to grope their way in to run those places. That's what appalled me. Of course, it didn't end there. Don't ask how, but from that day, Moon knew that I knew. Next day, for no reason at all, he said, sex. It's the very devil. Quite merciless. It betrays our manhood, rots our integrity. Isn't it, perhaps, the hell you were asking about, Birkin? And from that time on, things were never quite the same between us. For a few days now, I'd been having a second look at the picture's north side, the last stretch, the glad souls whose virtues had outweighed their iniquity in Michael's scales and now were streaming uphill to their reward. So by and large, the work was near enough done, and if I'd gone off on the instant, no one would have known the difference. But to satisfy myself, I had to gather up the whole, lightening here, not taking off all the grime there, leaving some to give body to an outlined limb or to contrast more starkly hair and face. The anxious time was over. I was in calm water now. The weather, those long, warm days, went on in majestic succession right through August. The front gardens of cottages were crammed with marjoram and roses, marguerites, sweet William, and at night the scent of stocks. The vale was heavy with leaves, motionless in the early morning, black caves of shadow in the midday heat, blurring the sounds of trains hammering north and south. Summertime. And summertime in my early 20s. And in love. No, better than that, secretly in love. Coddling it up in myself. It's an odd feeling, coming rarely more than once in most of our lifetimes. In books, as often as not, they represent it as a sort of anguish, but it wasn't so for me. Later, perhaps. But not then. I was married. Vinnie had gone off, but she'd shrewdly left the door open so that if need be, she could slip back before she went again. And Alice Keach. I was sure that she was a deeply religious woman. Marriage for her really did mean let no man put us under. Never forget this was 1920. Another world. So there it was, and there it would stay until the day I would go. Then for a year or two, perhaps we'd exchange a polite Christmas card, and after that we'd draw further away. But now, she was here, and unknowing, mine. Well, that's how I like to think of it. She came each day now, aware no doubt that soon Moon and I would be gone and Oxgodby the emptier. She told me of her school days in Hampshire, how she'd been very close to her father, and then he died, and a year afterwards she'd married. And this time, I changed the subject. I recall her coming in the day after my trip to Ripon when I was still thinking over what I'd been told about Moon. "You're not listening to me, Mr. Birkin," she called up. "Would you like me to sing to you?" And she began in a fair approximation of broad Yorkshire. Worthy the Lamb for sinners slain, cried the redeemed above, and broke off into giggles, then delicious peals of laughter. Be still, I said. That's a raw spot. Besides, I've something on my mind. So you're not working? Oh, yes, I am. I'm looking at it. You have to keep an eye on a picture or anything might happen. It might disappear again before your husband feels he's got his money's worth. Don't, please. You're right, sorry. Stupid thing to say. My husband, she began, and then was silent for a few moments. She tried again. In a village, it's not easy. He's a very sincere man. He thinks that perhaps we'd fit in better further south. He has a sister and brother in Sussex. It sounded like a cry for help. I like the people here, she went on. But I'm not sure they care much for us. We don't fit in. Oh, you're wrong, I said. Do you think so? Really? I know many local folk would be sorry if you ever decided to flit. Why, you're even a hit with the Wesleyans, I said, feeling she needed a boost. Mrs. Ellerbeck says you're very attractive. Now, what about that? Attractive? She said, as though this had never occurred to her, or that no one had told her so before. I moved to the edge of the platform and looked down. All right, Alice Keach, I thought. You're going to be pushed. You can lie awake in the dark, too. Many men would say you are more than attractive, I said. They'd say you were beautiful. I stopped short of I. Oh, she said, looking wildly for succor to Letitia struggling up from her tomb, knowing safety lay in retreat from the building, but not how to decently withdraw. Then she rallied and counterattacked. And you? She said. Me? Well, I'm not an artist, but they gave me a diploma at art school with a cast-iron guarantee that I could be relied upon to recognize beauty whenever my eyes fell thereon. So, professionally, I must tell you, yes, you're beautiful. Very. And could she have made herself go that little bit further and given me the nod, I would have recited a catalogue of her charms, in detail, because my blood was up. Delectissima. Amantissima. But fate and the preposterous guise of Mossop stepped in. Hey, Mr. Birkin, he bawled. I've heard there's a tag end will be getting you any day now. Would you like me to translate, Mrs. Keach? I called down. But she'd gone. Bailey.
See Radio 4. And now the final part of A Book at Bedtime, A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr. Tom Birkin's friendship with Charles Moon has altered. Charles is aware that Tom knows he was exposed as a homosexual during the Great War, and despite Tom's silent sympathy, things are getting awkward between them. His work on the wall painting nearly complete, Tom looks to the future. Will his wife come back to him? Would Alice consider leaving her husband? These questions and the mystery about the wall painting and the lost grave are all awaiting to be resolved.
I don't know whether Alice Keach told her husband that I found her beautiful. But first thing next day, he was in the building when I got back from my mug of tea with Moon. Mossop tells me the work on cleaning the wall painting is done, he said before I'd scarcely crossed the threshold. Yes, I see it is. Very good. So the executors have authorized me to make the final payment. It's here, £13 and 15 shillings, as we agreed. There had been a blank wall, and now it wasn't blank. There had been the nuisance of a scaffold and a man living in his belfry who could now be packed off. Great God, the vast creative process was hidden from him. The long-dead wall picture painter, and myself, who'd labored to drag his picture back into sight, neither of us had any meaning for him. It was that, as much as anything, that made me tell him that I should need the scaffolding for several more days. But you have finished, he said, and now you have been paid. I didn't ask for the money, I said. The job's not finished. I shall have the scaffolding removed, he said stubbornly. Then I shall inform the executors that you've prevented me completing my contract, and no doubt that will relieve them from forking out the £1,000 Miss Hebron left to the church. Conditionally. He got the message. I should not wish to quarrel with you, Mr. Birkin, he said. You will not be with us much longer, so if you wish the scaffolding to remain for a few days, it can remain. Doubtless you will be kind enough to inform me when I can ask the contractor to dismantle it. We faced each other for a few minutes without speaking. My anger had gone. I just wanted him to go away. But when he spoke, curiously enough, he used the same words as his wife. "It's not easy," he said. "I wasn't always, well, not as I may appear to be." I tried to look as though I didn't know what he was talking about. "I know how you see me. Moon, too." This was embarrassing. We had cast him in the role of a sour paymaster whom we hoped would go away and be a long time coming back, and he knew it. "It's not easy," he repeated. "The English are not a deeply religious people. I have yet to meet the man whose hair rose at the nape of his neck because he was about to taste the blood of his dying lord. They do not need me. You, too, have no need of me, Mr. Birkin. You have come back from a war where you have seen things beyond belief, things which you cannot talk of yet, can't forget, but things which are at the heart of religion. Even so, when I have approached you during your stay here, you have agreed that it is very pleasant weather for the time of year, and you have hoped that I shall go away." All this time, unusually, he was looking directly at me. Then he held out the envelope and went. Christ. That night as we walked back from the Shepherd's Arms, I told Moon of Keach's visit. "Well, old boy, I can see his point," he said. "You have finished." He didn't let me work up a protest. "Oh, come off it, of course you have. Whatever you're hanging about for, it's not to finish that job. You can't make it last forever." "I don't need to be told," I said. "For goodness sake," he said irritably, "you'll find that once you've dragged yourself off round the corner, there'll be another view. It may even be a better one." He looked quizzically at me. "You've dug in pretty deep, haven't you? The Ellebecks, Alice Keach." "What about you?" I said. "Yes, it's time I was off. It'll be autumn tomorrow, or the next day. I can smell it in the air, summer smouldering." "But you've not done what they'll pay you for." He laughed. "Well, I've done what I came to do. I found the Anglo-Saxon basilica that I knew was here, and all that's left is to write it up, which can be done later anywhere. So no, it actually has come round to Piers Hebron's turn. I shall dig up his grave, and I really do believe dear old Miss H is going to have her money's worth." He grinned. "As a matter of fact, I rather held my hand until you didn't have an excuse not to lend me one. Tomorrow's the day, my boy. Good night." Just before I bedded down, I stood at the window. And he was right. The first breath of autumn was in the air. A prodigal feeling. A feeling of wanting, taking, and keeping before it is too late. Next morning he routed me out, shouting that I was to have breakfast with him. When we'd eaten, he produced what he called a Douthwaite's divining rod, a long steel shaft with a very sharp point the blacksmith had made for him, and we sallied forth. He had it all worked out, and we took up positions at the depression he'd claimed to see the day I'd first met him, a stride's length into the meadow from the wall's south side. If he was excommunicated and the family had been forbidden to bury him in the churchyard, it's about as near as they could get him to the altar. I've had my tape measure out. He let me do the donkey work, beating his rod into the earth with a hammer until it reached what he called the hope zone. Then he took over, striking more gently, and after each blow putting an ear close enough to hear vibration coming from below. "Right," he said. "We struck stone. Just let me chalk it at ground level, and we'll try a foot each way." A foot east we struck stone again, and again a foot east of that. "This is highly satisfactory, my good man," Moon said, rubbing his hands. "It only goes to show how much there is in folk memory. I have a spade to hand. You shall cut the first sod, and I can announce with utter assurance to you and the waiting world that you will find Piers as deep as this spade is long." It was extremely hot work, and it went on all morning until we left off for our bread and Wensleydale and a doze in the sun. Then Moon lowered himself into the pit, crouched on his haunches, and began carefully to trowel earth into a carpenter's tool bag, which now and then I was bidden to haul up. Cathy Ellebeck came, the Reverend J.G. Keach came, Mr. Douthwaite came, but they found no more than a deepening hole, and departed sorrowing. Then Moon found what he swore was a horn button. 15th century, he claimed, right on target. It was close on 6 when, excitement getting the better of him, he abandoned the trowel and began brushing away with rapid strokes, so rapid indeed that you could say the stone swam into sight. A carved shaft branched gracefully into whorls of stone raised upon a convex lid. At its head, a hand holding the sacramental cup, a wafer poised at its rim. "Come on," I said. "Is it Piers or isn't it?" Instead of replying, he climbed out and said, "No name, just Miserimus. I of all men most wretched." Good God, they really had it in for the poor devil. Then he fetched a camera and photographed it from all sides. "For publication," he explained. "Against the day when I need a job at university. They don't want to know if you're any good, just what you've published. Now," he went on, "let's have a peep inside before you round up the colonel and make him sign a chit for his ancestor." We slid into the pit, and I pushed while he pulled until the great stone lid pivoted and we could see the full length of the collapsed skeleton. We crouched and peered at it. "Excellent condition. Really first class," Moon muttered. "It must have been absolutely airtight. But look. See it? Third rib down." He bent lower and blew. "There." A metal thing swung from the rib cage. He poked in a pencil and delicately fished it out. Well, well. The crescent. So that was why they wouldn't let him into the church. Piers was a Muslim. Caught in some expedition and then became a convert to save his skin. Heavens, can you imagine the ructions when he turned up in Oxgodby again? Now what's the colonel going to say? He looked quizzically at me. "Shall we let sleeping dogs lie? Particularly heretic dogs?" And he eased out the chain, snapped a link, and dropped it into a handkerchief. "Now," he said, "you round up Keach and I'll alert the colonel and we'll show off our Exhibit A. Then we'll put the chain back and leave him with his reputation no worse than it was before. But first, we'll climb your ladder and have a look at his face before it fell off." Do you know, until that moment, it hadn't occurred to me that this bundle of bones was my falling man. The next day was Saturday, and now that Moon was done, I decided to bring the job to its end. So I sent word that I shouldn't be able to umpire for the team at Steeple Cinderby, and after working through the morning, came down the ladder about 2 o'clock. I took my bread and cheese outside, half hoping Moon would be about. But he wasn't, and later I found that he'd gone to York on the morning train. So I sat on Elijah's tomb slab, and when I'd eaten and smoked a woodbine, fell asleep and sprawled across the warm stone. When I awoke, Alice Keach must have been there for some time because she was smiling. "I thought I'd find you here," she said. "I brought you a bag of apples. They're ribstone pippins. They do well up here." Then, quite unexpectedly, she asked if she could see my living quarters in the bell tower, and we climbed there. "So this is where you spy on us during Sunday services," she said, looking down. Then she turned so that her breasts were pressing against me. I should have kissed her. It was why she'd come. Then everything would have been different. My life. Hers. We would have had to speak and say aloud what both of us knew, and then, maybe, turned from the window and lain down together on my makeshift bed. Afterwards, we would have gone away. Maybe on the next train. My heart was racing. I was breathless. She leaned on me, waiting. And I did nothing. And said nothing. She drew back and said shakily, "I shall have to hurry away. Arthur will be wondering what's become of me. No, please don't come down." Then she was gone. I knew I should never see her again. Somehow I got through the rest of the day, and during the night a wind got up, driving in great gusts at the tower. Morning came marvelously clear. The trees had stripped down to their black bones and had heaped leaves in drifts against hedges and walls. I looked down from my window for a long time. Summer and autumn had gone. The year had crossed into another season. That morning I had my first letter. Heaven knows how she had learnt where I was, but it was from my wife. Vinnie wanted me home again. She wanted me back. I had no illusions. She would go off again, would come back again. And I should be there. I packed up my gear, everything but my remarkable overcoat. I'd left it hanging on its nail for Mossop. He'd pointedly admired it more than once, and I'd nothing else to give. Then I went down into the church and had a last look round. Behind the south arcade, I read, for the last time, her grieving husband's farewell to Letitia. Ah, amantissima et delectissima, veli. And I thought, perhaps you did well to leave early. It may not have lasted. Then I gazed beyond the scaffolding to the great painting half hidden in the shadows. I knew that whatever else had befallen me during those few weeks in the country, I had lived with a very great artist, my secret sharer of the long hours I'd labored in the half-light above the arch. So I turned and climbed the ladder for a last look. And standing before the great spread of color, I felt the old tingling excitement and a sureness that the time would come when some stranger would stand there too and understand. All this happened so long ago. We can ask and ask, but we can't have again what seemed ours forever. The way things looked, that church alone in the fields, a bed on a belfry floor, a remembered voice, the touch of a hand, a loved face. They've gone, and you can only wait for the pain to pass. And I never returned, never wrote, never met anyone who might have given me news of Oxgodby. So in memory, it stays as I left it, a sealed room furnished by the past, airless, still, ink long dry on a put-down pen. But this was something I knew nothing of, as I closed the gate and set off across the meadow.
That was the final part of A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr. It was abridged by Elizabeth Bradbury and read by Samuel West and produced by Tracy O'Neill.